This is the Bible Book Club.
And we're so excited to be in one of my favorite books, the Book of Ruth.
Welcome to the club. Susan, you've titled this episode, What Happens on the Floor Stays on the Floor. I'm intrigued. Is this going to be a racy episode?
It really is, actually. So stay tuned.
Okay, well, can't wait to hear what happens in chapter 3. But last episode in chapter 2, Ruth took charge of the household and stepped out in faith to work the harvest. Naomi was quiet. She might have been depressed, we've decided, and did not offer any guidance to her daughter-in-law, but God was guiding Ruth. And she just happened to land in the field owned by a man of standing and also a relative, Boaz. Upon learning who Ruth was, Boaz stepped up and provided generously for the two widows. Boaz's attention to Ruth grows and includes an invitation to lunch. By the time Ruth gets home, she is full of news about Boaz and also food for her mother-in-law. Naomi responds, and a little seed of hope is planted in the widow's heart.
Okay, here's our setup. In today's episode, Boaz is going to step in as Goel and lever. In last episode, chapter 2, verse 20, Naomi said this.
The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness,
or has said,
to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers.
All right, what is a guardian redeemer, which also can be called a kinsman redeemer, which I actually like that word better. Or in Hebrew, it's called Goel. By definition, a Goel means redeemer in Hebrew. Moses gave these instructions in Leviticus 25. You can go back and listen to season 3, episode 14 for more. A Goel is a person who, as the closest relative, is responsible for protecting and providing for family members in times of need when they cannot help themselves. A Goel or kinsman redeemer may do many things, such as redeeming or buying back a relative's land if it had to be sold, redeeming the relative if they had sold themselves into slavery, avenging a relative's life if they were murdered, because they can't help themselves, or redeeming the name of a relative if they died childless by marrying their widow and having a child in their name, as in our story today. Now, I think in many situations today, we could use this concept of guardian redeemers. Family members should help restore a person's rights when they are unable to do it for themselves. In chapter 2, Boaz stepped up to fill the role of kinsman redeemer by providing for Naomi and Ruth. He provided food and work for Ruth. But he is not the closest relative, we will soon find out. In this chapter, Boaz will take his responsibility much further by becoming the lever. What is a lever? And what is a levirate marriage? By definition, a lever means husband's brother. You can see Deuteronomy 25 or listen to season 5, episode 12 for Moses' instructions on that. The lever is a man who marries his brother's widow to produce an heir for his brother. Sounds really weird. The main idea behind the levirate is that if a man died without a male heir, his brother should marry his widow and their son would inherit the deceased brother's name and that all-important promised land that had been assigned to him. The practice ensured that the property would remain within the family and the dead brother's name would be carried forward. Now remember, this was a huge deal in Joshua and all throughout Moses. Then we got to the promised land, they'd each be assigned their land, and their land would be passed on generation to generation to generation, and it would kind of carry on their name and the family, because that's what they were promised. That's kind of tied up to their inheritance. The first Bible story of a lever is a fascinating one. It was in Genesis 38, season 1, episode 30. It was the story of Judah and Tamar. Now, Judah's son Er married Tamar, then died. So she's childless widow. Judah told his next son, the lever, Onan, to marry Tamar and produce a son for Er. But Onan refused because the child would not be counted as his. as the lever. It would be counted as his brother's. His refusal offended God, and so he too died childless. Now, Judah told Tamar to wait for his third son, Shelah, to grow up. But then Judah started rethinking that and grew hesitant, fearing that Shelah would also die because, two sons have kind of died so far because of Tamar. So Judah sends Tamar home to live with her father and wait. Well, Tamar got tired of waiting, and she dressed up like a prostitute and tricked Judah himself, her father-in-law, into producing a child with her.
Kind of weird.
Very weird. Tamar gave birth to actually twins, but the oldest, Perez, we will find out was a great-great-grandfather to Boaz. There are so many crazy ways that God grafts outsiders into the line of Christ. Tamar was a Canaanite, making Perez half Canaanite, which makes Boaz part Canaanite. Then Ruth is grafted in, making her son half Moabite, part Canaanite, part Israelite. It's crazy. Back to our story. The situation in the Book of Ruth does not exactly match the laws in Leviticus for the kinsman redeemer and in Deuteronomy for the lever. First, Naomi and Ruth are not in debt or slaves. They're just poor. Second, Boaz is not a brother. He is just a member of the same clan. Malone and Kilon both died. There are no brothers. And Boaz is not even the closest relative in the clan. Boaz really would never have been expected to do anything for Ruth and Naomi. He had plenty of excuses to get out of it, but he will make none. All right, here we go. Chapter 3, Scene 1. Naomi plays matchmaker. This conversation takes place several months after Ruth and Boaz started, air quotes, talking in the field and then, had lunch together, or what I call their first date. Naomi is in a much better place. Ruth brings home food and news about what's going on in the world and the fields every day. The association with Boaz had probably given Ruth a certain amount of acceptance in the community. To the community, Boaz is just being Boaz, a good Israelite caring for the widows. Boaz is protecting the widows, and so his workers, and probably their wives, those ones that were talking about Ruth and Naomi when they walked into town.
Calling her Ruth the Moabite.
Exactly. They know they have to be nice to Ruth because, hey, she's Boaz's girl now. And Boaz is also providing for the widows with work for Ruth and food for both. From Naomi's perspective, she sees that Ruth the Moabite is being grafted into the community of God, which gives Naomi hope. Her self-absorption begins to dissipate, and her cold, unhappy heart begins to melt. Naomi begins to see the potential in the situation, and her mind begins to scheme. And our scheming little Naomi wants more for Ruth. She is not merely content with being saved from starvation. She wants Ruth to be tied to the Savior himself. Gleaning in Boaz's field and eating his bread is not enough. Naomi wants Ruth to know this Redeemer in the most profound way. She wants Ruth to belong to him permanently. What if Ruth married Boaz, she thinks. As a wife, Ruth would have the promise of land and her future would be secure. And guess what? So would Naomi's. Naomi wants Ruth to marry the kinsman redeemer. Now, what Naomi desires for Ruth and Boaz is what God wants for us. The picture we have before us of Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, and Ruth, a Gentile in need of a savior, is a foreshadowing of Christ, the Redeemer, and us, the church, in need of a savior. Boaz, the bridegroom, and Ruth, the bride, mirror what is to come through their seed, Jesus, the bridegroom, and the church, the bride. And the way God silently moved behind the scenes to bring Ruth and Boaz together is the same for us. It is a mystery of silence. The process of redemption is an invisible process where behind the scenes events transpire to bring us into personal relationship with the Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Well, Naomi has caught a vision and she reaches for the sky. She doesn't just want any match for Ruth. She wants a match made in heaven. Little did she know, God was way ahead of her. Chapter 3.
One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do.
Naomi's idea is scandalous. I have tried to picture this scene, and I have come to the conclusion that there had to be more discussion than this. Or was Ruth just exhausted and too tired to ask questions? I don't know, because I would have had a million. It must have taken place in the evening because Ruth was home from work. Or perhaps with the threshing beginning, was the harvesting complete and Ruth was out of a job? I don't know. In any case, Ruth is energetic, so she must have done something that day. Like maybe she was grinding all that barley and wheat she had collected. Maybe she was making dinner. Naomi comes in and stops Ruth from tasking and tells her to get ready for a trip to the threshing floor. I would have looked up at Naomi and said, "Why would I put on my best dress and perfume to go lay down next to sweaty, smelly men on a dusty floor?" But not Ruth. She says, "I will do whatever you say." Ruth had to know more than we know, because this is very risky business, and here is why. First, Naomi tells Ruth to wash, perfume, and dress up. This is not too crazy, but it sets the tone. Ruth is clearly supposed to make herself attractive and alluring. Now, perfume really did exist back then. I looked this up. It consisted of scented oils, so essential oils. Here we go again. And as to her clothes, most commentaries assume that Ruth was wearing widow's garments, and Naomi was instructing her to put on regular clothes. So she's not dressing up like a prostitute, people. She's literally just putting on pretty clothes. The change in her clothing would declare her available to other men, and to Boaz in particularly, who clearly needs a little prodding, in my opinion, because they have been, air quotes, talking for a few months now, and the man is not getting younger. The second reason this is risky is that going to the threshing floor is an inappropriate destination for a woman. Threshing floors were usually in a secluded place, and the men slept there to protect the harvest that was being chaffed. So, growing barley and wheat was a big deal. And then finally it's time to harvest, and they take it up to this threshing floor and they throw it into the air, and that separates the wheat from the chaff. And so the wheat or barley was precious. They were just coming off a famine. So, if you wanted to eat some in the coming months and you didn't want to glean in the fields, you would have gotten lazy and tried to steal it. Now, this was an intense period of work and often took place well into the night when the breezes aided in the separation process. The workers ate, drank, and slept on the threshing floor. In addition, following a famine, the vibe may have been supercharged, like celebratory. This is such a happy time for this little town of Bethlehem that's been in a famine. Now, something else to know, which is interesting, comes from Hosea 9:1, which implies that prostitutes frequented the threshing floors looking for business, which makes sense because a lot of men in one place, possibly without wives, would have been good business for a prostitute. So for a female like Ruth to go alone at night to the threshing floor after the boys have celebrated the day's hard work with food and wine, was very promiscuous and could be interpreted as an invitation. The final risky move was this. Naomi told Ruth to lie down and uncover Boaz's feet.
Also kind of weird.
Yeah, which was extremely intimate and a submissive gesture back then. For a woman at night, this submissiveness would have meant one thing. The woman desires sexual intimacy. I am not making this up. Go read the commentaries.
So wouldn't there be like lots of men around this threshing floor, not just him? Wouldn't they not be alone in this room?
Okay. So the place, her appearance, and her actions were boldly overt. Boaz could not misinterpret. But know this, you haven't read this verse yet, but it clearly says he went to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. So again, God's providence, he's off in the corner. So the place, her appearance, and her actions were boldly overt. Boaz could not misinterpret. In summary, Naomi has told Ruth to attract Boaz with her appearance, approach him suggestively, and then wait. Just wait on pins and needles to see what he does. What was Naomi thinking? Ruth's reputation and future are placed totally in Boaz's hands. So much could go wrong here. Boaz was wealthy, powerful, older, and still single. He could have married a lot of girls if he wished over the years. What if he doesn't want to marry at all and mocks her for being so crazy as to think he would pick her, of all people, a Moabite, when he could have married so many others? What if Boaz gets mad? He could see her actions as promiscuous and expose her right there and then for behaving like a prostitute. What if Boaz had been drinking and becomes aroused? He could take advantage of her without any intention of marrying her, which could put her in the future position of giving favors for the opportunity to glean in his fields forever. What was Naomi's hidden agenda? Some think that certain aspects of this, like the covering of one with a garment, was a normal indication of an engagement. But others think in secret at night was taking it too far to be customary. The majority of the commentaries agree. Naomi was creating a sensual tension, and why we don't know. Perhaps Naomi knew something about Boaz that we don't. Perhaps he needed this blatant sign of Ruth's desire to give him confidence. In response to Naomi's instructions, Ruth just simply obeys. And while this is definitely not normal behavior for a widow, and the sexual overtones seem so out of character for our humble heroine, the commentaries agree that Ruth's motives were pure. So maybe she too knew something about Boaz, because it worked. Knowing Naomi was behind this, and that the motive of her heart was hesed or loving, must have given Ruth confidence. But I think she had to be scared to death. And that walk from her home to the threshing floor had to have been fraught with thoughts of what to do, what to say, and all the possible scenarios of how Boaz could respond, and possible strategies of how she should respond to his response, and how to get out of the whole thing if it didn't go down the way she wanted. My mind would have been outpacing my heart, and my heart would have definitely been at about 120 by the time I got there. But what makes it all the more interesting is that Ruth landed on just the right thing to say, and most cleverly added a challenge of her own on top of Naomi's instructions. Naomi is not the only one with a plan. The girl has game too. Scene 2. What happens on the floor stays on the floor.
Verse 7, when Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family."
So let's picture this. Ruth arrives, stressed out, thinking of all the things that could happen. And fortunately for her, she sees Boaz in the dark, I don't know how, all the way in the far corner. Well, that was the Lord's providence. But Ruth does not follow the plan exactly. Ruth takes the initiative and adds to Naomi's instructions with just one sentence. She says,
"Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family."
Now, you got to know this. In Hebrew, the word for corner of your garment also means wings. And in chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz had prayed this:
"May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge."
Boaz had prayed that Ruth would be rewarded by the God under whose wing she had sought refuge. And here, Ruth asks Boaz to spread his wings, that garment, over her and to be the one to reward her as the kinsman redeemer. Ruth cleverly uses his very own word, wings, asking Boaz to be the one God uses to reward her. She is asking Boaz to be the answer to his own prayer for her by making her his wife. Because spreading your wings or garment over someone was also an expression of marriage. For a godly man like Boaz, her use of words was a direct hit and way more convincing than what Naomi had planned. How could Boaz refuse? Ruth had humbly placed herself at his feet and boldly said, "It is me, Ruth. You are God's plan for me, so marry me. Cover me, Goel. Be my redeemer." The whole scene is perfection, but to the world it must have seemed absurd. One commentary, Daniel Block, described the absurdity of this proposal like this: "Here is a servant demanding that the boss marry her, a Moabite making the demand of an Israelite, a woman making the demand of a man, a poor person making the demand of a rich man. Was this an act of a foreigner's naivete, or a daughter-in-law's devotion to her mother-in-law, or another sign of the hidden hand of God?" From a natural perspective, the scheme was doomed from the beginning as a hopeless gamble, and the responsibility Naomi placed on Ruth was quite unreasonable, but it worked.
Continuing in verse 10, "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor."
It worked because of God's providence, and Boaz does not disappoint. He does not take advantage of Ruth. No way. He blesses her because Boaz does not see this as promiscuous or as Ruth's attempt to entrap him. He sees her proposal to him as kindness, greater kindness even than her hesed to Naomi. He sees Ruth's bold marriage proposal as loyalty, not lust. Her marriage to him was an act of hesed that would reclaim Elimelech's land for Naomi and restore the future she had tragically lost. He knows that as a younger woman, Ruth could have made herself available to others. But to honor her dead husband's name, she is faithfully offering herself to him. Now, if you're thinking this must have been a great sacrifice on her part, I don't think so. Nowhere do the commentaries think that Boaz is super old and frail. But we do know that he is older than Ruth, and it is thought that Ruth is more attractive than Boaz. So in his eyes, she could have gone after someone younger. I would like to think there is the making of more than hesed and a levirate marriage here. I think Boaz is attracted to Ruth, and she is enamored of him. God can do that. He can delight them with love and a happy marriage. And why shouldn't he? In a sexually charged scene where the potential for sin and abuse is high, both Boaz and Ruth display hesed, true love, and hayil, honor, in their words and actions. Neither takes advantage of the other for personal gain or gratification. Think what a comparison Boaz and Ruth are to Samson and Delilah.
Well, there's really no comparison.
There's no comparison.
That.
We could spend 20 minutes at least discussing the differences. The purity and respectfulness of Boaz and Ruth is beautiful. Instead of engaging in steamy sexual encounters fraught with danger, like Samson and Delilah, Boaz does not take advantage of Ruth, nor does Ruth try to trick or entrap Boaz.
Continuing in verse 11, "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character."
I love Boaz. Now, not as much as Joshua. You know, I was crushing on Joshua. But from the beginning, that first day in the field, Boaz really has seen Ruth. And in this moment, he sees her fear and desires to relieve her anxiety. He says, "Don't be afraid." Then he gave her a beautiful compliment. He says she is a woman of hayil, or noble character. This is the second mention of the word hayil. We discussed the first back in episode 1. There are 3 times the word hayil is mentioned in the Book of Ruth. Once for Boaz in chapter 2, once for Ruth here in chapter 3, and once for the couple together in chapter 4. Boaz sees Ruth as a woman of noble character, or hayil. And now he wants her to be his wife of noble character. Does this sound familiar? Ruth is the only woman in the Bible described so overtly using the exact same words as Proverbs 31.
Proverbs 31, starting in verse 10. "A wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still night. She provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings that she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. In her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of the idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate.
The Hebrew words in both Proverbs and this chapter of Ruth are the same. Aset hayil, which means a virtuous wife or woman. The wife and woman is interchangeable. Proverbs 31 is a tall order for any woman, but it is an ideal to shoot for. Reading Ruth with Proverbs 31 gives us a vision of what it looks like for a godly woman to live in an ungodly culture. Humble Ruth is an encouragement to try, for she became a Proverbs 31 woman without any special advantages in life during a very dark period. Like the Proverbs 31 woman, Ruth had integrity and moral character. Ruth was capable and hardworking. Ruth was wise and decisive. Ruth was kind and compassionate. Ruth was faithful to God and her family. Perhaps this is why Boaz is not yet married despite his age. Had Boaz been waiting and watching for a Proverbs 31 woman, God did not fail him. Ruth is a woman of noble character, about to become a wife of noble character.
Verse 12, although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is no other who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town.
So Boaz did indeed give Ruth instructions as Naomi said he would. He informs her of the other guy. By marrying Ruth, Boaz would be redeeming more than her. He would be redeeming the name and estate of Elimelech. To do that, he must first offer it to the kinsman who is next in line, as it is not Boaz. There is one in front of him. Then he expresses his concern for Ruth's reputation and safety. What happened on the floor must stay on the floor. She must not try to go home in the middle of the night. It was too dangerous. She must leave in the early morning before she can't be recognized. Now, his comment that no one must know she was there may have been said to his trusty manager, who may have been awake. Then he gives her food, of course. He has a thing about food. His love language must be gifts of food. He gave her 6 measures of barley seed as a gift, just 1 measure short of God's perfect number of completion, the number 7. Many commentaries interpret this as a promise of a 7th seed to be given to Naomi through Ruth's marriage, a marriage that produces the ultimate redeemer and a much greater harvest.
So we're cheekily saying what happens on the threshing floor stays on the threshing floor, but it seems to me that nothing really sexual happened on the threshing floor. It was just the proposal or them agreeing that they are in love, basically, and they want to marry each other, and he's going to show her how let's go about this the right way.
Yes.
Just wanted to make sure I interpreted that.
Yes,
right.
Nothing happened because Boaz is not.
He's a man of honor.
He's not Samson. He's a man of hail. All right, scene 3. Ruth has good news for Naomi.
Verse 16, when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter?
All right, this last question, this is funny in the commentaries. In Hebrew, this last question really reads, who art thou, my daughter? Naomi is so confident and sassy that with this question, who are you, Ruth? She is suggesting that there might be a status change in Ruth's name. Like, who are you, Miss Ruth or Mrs. Boaz? It's a funny thing with Ruth. We have to remember that people are always trying to identify who she is. It's a trend. When she came to town, the women identified her as Ruth the Moabite. Then Boaz asked his foreman, who is she? And was told she is the Moabite who belongs to Naomi. Then last night on the threshing floor, Boaz sits up, doesn't recognize her because it was too dark, or was it her new clothes? We don't know. And he asks, who are you? And now Naomi, the sassy matchmaker, who knows very well who she is, asks her, who are you? But perhaps that is the point God is trying to make in this story. The women of the town didn't really see her. They saw her as a foreigner, a Moabite, and they didn't want to know her. Boaz, on the other hand, really saw her and came to know her as a woman of God. He saw her heart. Then Boaz doesn't recognize her on the threshing floor until his eyes were opened to see her in a different light as a woman available and interested in him. Now, Naomi has known her all along. So when she asks who Ruth is, it is because she is sassy and tickled to the core. Naomi is depressed no more. She is having fun again. The irony is this. There will never be any more confusion in the world about who Ruth is. Everyone knows who Ruth is. Her biography is included in the #1 bestseller of all time, the Bible.
Continuing in verse 16. Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.
Boaz's use of the words empty-handed is a reference back to chapter 1, verse 21, where Naomi in bitterness said,
I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty.
This barley seed that Boaz gives to Ruth for Naomi is a promise to Naomi from God through Boaz. It is a gift of Hesed. She will never be empty again.
Verse 18, then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today.
Naomi's vision for Ruth is growing sharper and clearer, and her heart is growing lighter. Just you wait, she says to Ruth. And I don't think she said it from that rocking chair of depression. Oh no, Naomi grabbed both of Ruth's hands in hers and danced around the house with joy.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.